Hello, everybody. Welcome to this really special session of Author Visit with Lauren Willig. We're so excited to have her here, and we are also excited to have you here. My name is Mina Jane. I am one of the programming librarians at the Cary Library, and I have to say that I have been trying to get Lauren to visit with me for a long time, so this was an absolutely wonderful opportunity to make that happen.
I'm sorry, it's the pandemic.
That's right. Oh, it's too bad, but I'm taking advantage of it. Two things. I want to thank Split Rock Books for offering signed books from Lauren for you for this program. So if you have not bought the books yet, if you would like to, you can still order to the end of today in order to get a signed book from Lauren. And as a librarian, I always say that signed books are gold. They're great gifts. They're great to read. They're great to keep forever. So think about that. I would like to thank our foundation for always supporting our adult programming. That's the Cary Library Foundation. So I'm going to do a quick introduction, and then Lauren's she's gonna be the big face on the on the screen for you. You might know Lauren Willig. She's a best-selling author, Pink Carnation series. She writes books with Karen White and Beatrice Williams, also wonderful. And she has a history degree from Harvard and a law degree from Harvard, and apparently wrote the first 3 books of the Pink Carnation series while she was in law school. So overachiever much? I don't know. I mean, the books are amazing, so something was working. When I was reading her bio, though, I realized that she and I have something in common, and it's not stalking Lauren Willig. That's my thing. Apparently, she wrote a book when she was 6 years old, and she sent it to a publisher. She was, what was it, 300 pages, Lauren?
Yes, handwritten, of course.
Yes. So she didn't get a response, but I also wrote a book when I was about that age. I did not send it to a publisher. I threw it away. And
no.
Yeah, it was a love story between Nancy and Ned of Nancy Drew. And it was torrid for a 8-year-old, right?
Well,
so
yeah.
I was so
they
sad.
Hold hands?
I know, it was ridiculous, and I threw it away. But when I was reading that, I thought, what could I have done if I hadn't done that? You know, my life would have been totally different. And so, watching what you're doing, I'm thinking that could have been me. So,
well, the funny thing is, my 9-year-old book that I sent off to Simon Schuster was also inspired by Nancy Drew. It was high concept. The idea was, instead of one girl detective, I had twin girl detectives. And the villain was the algebra teacher. I could give it away because the book will never be published.
Well,
how could they not go for this?
That's so funny, because my book, they just made out a lot, you know.
The funny thing is, I don't think I even had a Ned equivalent in that book, which is funny given that I wrote romance later on, but this one was purely mystery.
Oh, that's so funny. So I'm going to start with a question, and then I know you're going to talk for a few minutes, and then we will continually take questions from anybody who is interested in learning more about Lauren. So I have to say that I was introduced to your books by the Pink Carnation ones. And when I first started out as a librarian, people always told me I should read your books because I loved the 3 Musketeers. And so, when I picked them up, I was just in love with them. And I was so happy that it was a series and I could revisit them over and over again. But in your more recent books, in The Summer Country just came out in paperback a few weeks ago, I love your differing backgrounds. I love that you set your books in different places that aren't like Regency England or, the mountains of North Dakota or something like that. It's always different. And it's so interesting to me that that in this day and age with, the things going on in the world, that you picked, the slavery trade in Barbados as part of your last book. So my question for you is, what draws you to a particular location and time period?
Yeah, the funny thing is, a lot of these, I tend to fall into most of my books by accident. So if you asked me what I was going to write about, I went to grad school to write massive epic novels about Tudor Stuart England. And, my big plan was I was getting my PhD in English Civil War stuff, and I was going to write a big English Civil War epic. And I wound up writing about Regency England because I needed to do something to distract myself from the English Civil War. And those were never supposed to be the books I was going to write. And so when I decided to start writing things other than the Pink Carnation series, because although I love the pink books, I didn't want to be the pink lady forever. I always said that the next thing I was going to write would be my vast English Civil War epic. And I keep saying that, and I never actually write it. So I wrote a book about a woman who bolted to Kenya in the 1920s. And so my first standalone wound up being inspired by that. And that's the sort of thing that tends to happen to me. I get struck by by a character or a historical anomaly, and I think, wow, what would happen if you took this scenario and ran with it? And that's how most of my standalone novels have happened. The Summer Country is a really extreme example of that. This is a book that has lived with me for a very long time and that I never originally intended to write. If you had asked me 15 years ago, would you write a book about the slave trade? I would have said, oh God, no, I don't want to touch anything that miserable with a 10-foot pole. But I went on a Caribbean vacation with my two best friends from grad school. And this was supposed to be total relaxation. We were going to lie on the beach and drink fruity drinks and, not do anything strenuous, but we tried that. We tried the lying on the beach thing. And we're all really pale after living in libraries. And we got really badly sunburned and bug bitten. And we're like, oh, the hell with it. Let's just do what historians do and find something old. So we went on a plantation tour. And we were told a story on the tour about the plantation burning down and a child dying in the fire, the Portuguese ward of the owner. But what really intrigued me was that this child was actually neither Portuguese nor his ward. She was his daughter by an enslaved woman. And the rest of the story, as we were told, was just entirely about the slave owner and how he went mad after his child died and spent the rest of his life rocking on the ruined veranda, chasing the shade. And you could still hear the creak, creak, creak of his rocking chair. And it was all wonderfully Gothic. I love a good Gothic, but I just couldn't stop wondering, where's the mother of this child? This nameless enslaved woman, who was she? Was she there with her child? Was she snuck into the house as a nursemaid or some other sort of domestic servant? Was the child torn from her? Did she agree to this to give her child a better life? Was she ever consulted? What was her relationship, if it can be called that, with the plantation owner? In the real story, the story I heard that day, there were two kids, one who died and one who didn't, and you wonder, okay, there are two kids of this liaison, if you can call it that. If he cared enough that he wanted the children to be brought into society, even sideways, why didn't he manumit them? Why didn't he manumit their mother? What was going on here? And I asked where the mother was, and the tour guide didn't know anything about her. She was just an enslaved woman. That was it. No name, no nothing. And it haunted me, this missing mother and what she must have felt through all this. And, it's funny, I went back home and I was writing the pink books in my first standalone at the time. And my editor said to me, okay, so where are you going to write next? You can write anything you like. And I said, well, I have this idea for a book set on a Caribbean plantation. And she was like, whoa, 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 whoa. Hold it right there. Stop. You can write anything you like, as long as it's set in England. And then she thought for a moment and was like, wait, actually, you can write anything you want so long as it's set in 19th century England. And so I said, okay, maybe I'm not the person to write this book. Maybe I was not supposed to write this. Maybe I was never meant to write this. I should let this story go. And I wrote another book set in 19th century England, and then some more books set in 19th century England. But the story wouldn't let me go. And finally, my agent said, okay, you've been talking about this book forever. Just write it already. So that's a really extreme example of how my books happen. Is often a character or a scenario will leap out at me and I just can't stop thinking about it. They become more real than the real people in my life to me. And I'd say it's also, I loved what you said about places and unusual places. And I grew up as a reader in what really shaped me as both a reader and a writer were the books coming out in the early 80s through the 90s. Those great big blockbuster epics like The Thornbirds and MMK's Far Pavilions. And I loved the multiplicity of settings. And I remember reading a book about the great earthquake in Lisbon when I was like 12 and being completely fascinated. This being plunged into another world and another time in historical events you know nothing about. And that's something I've missed a lot as a reader, because I feel like our worlds have narrowed to, and I love Regency England. Don't get me wrong. I love the Regency. I love Edwardian England. I love the Victorians. I even, in a weird, twisted way, love World War I, even though it makes me sad. But I really miss books that take me other places. And so when I wrote Summer Country, part of that was that longing to explore other places and visit other worlds and try to figure out how other time periods and other mindsets worked. What made people tick there? Okay, and that was a very long answer. I think I completely lost the thrust of the question. Oh, and I also want to back up because I feel like I'm a little topsy-turvy right now. I apologize. I have one kid who stays up really late and one who wakes up really early. So I'm running about 4 hours of sleep. So that's why I'm a little bit garbled. But I want to belatedly say thank you so much to Mina for organizing this and Cary Memorial Library. I want to thank all of you for coming on a Tuesday night, which I know can be hard, especially for people with children. I so get that. And it is such a delight to see in the gallery so many faces for which I previously only had names. So it's lovely to see you here semi in person and hopefully one day in person for real. And now, if you guys are not afraid of starting me up again, I'm happy to answer any other questions.
Sure, we already have a few in chat. Lisa would like to know, what character across all of your novels do you love the most?
That's an easy one. Turnip Fitzhugh from The Mischief of the Mistletoe. I adore him. He was a character who was never meant to be a hero. He started as a running joke in, I should remember these things, but so long ago. I can't remember whether I first mentioned him in the first book or if I only introduced him in the second book. But either way, he was meant to be a total joke character. He was the blundering, not even a beta male, he's a gamma male. He was that blundering character you always meet in Regency novels who trips over his own feet and says, what, and don't you know a lot, and always has really brightly patterned waistcoats. And the funny thing was, though, when I decided to give him his own book, he transformed into a strangely endearing hero. And I still get more mail about Turnip Fitzhugh than any other character. And I adore Turnip because I know, if I needed someone to carry bags for me or get things off high places, Turnip would be falling over his own feet to do that for me. He may not be the artist, but he's a gentleman through and through.
I do then have to ask how you came up with that name.
I am a huge fan of the British comedy series Blackadder. I grew up on Blackadder. And anyone else familiar with Blackadder? Yes. Anyway, so when I wrote the Pink series, that first book was really meant as a private in-joke for me and a few good friends when I was in grad school. Because I was working on my dissertation, I was burned out, I was cranky, I was thinking in footnotes, and I was like, I need to write something fun that will remind me of why I love fiction and why I love history. And so that first book was a mashup, really, of the Scarlet Pimpernel, Julia Quinn, and lots of Blackadder. And because it was so strongly Blackadder inflected, I put in a lot of sheep jokes and deliberate anachronisms, because that's really a Blackadder thing, the clever anachronism, and turnips, because there's a running joke in Blackadder about his servant Baldric, whose dream is to have his dream turnip. He just wants a nice little turnip in the country. And it makes sense if you've seen Blackadder. It totally sounds insane if you hadn't. So I had a running joke with some friends at the time that turnips were an inherently funny vegetable. So when I needed a character who needed a silly nickname, there was no doubt in my mind that he was going to be Turnip. It just never occurred to me that Turnip would be a hero someday. He was meant to be a throwaway joke character, but that's the thing. When I was writing my series, my throwaway joke characters tend to come back. Even my throwaway non-joke characters tend to come back. I've learned that anyone who shows up is going to come back to bite me in some way later.
Well, we're glad that Turnip did. Kara says, thank you for all of the books. And do you have any plans for a new series?
Well, I would love to write a new series. And in fact, I regularly scare my agent by telling her that I'm going to do just that. My dream is to write a Pink Carnation spin-off series. For those who have read the Pink series, it would be about Arabella Selwick Alderley, the aunt of Colin in the modern bit, but in her youth, in the late 1940s, right after World War II, when she's a young army wife traveling from colonial hotspot to colonial hotspot, because I find that transitional period when the empire is winding down and people are seeking their freedom and there's intrigue all over just deeply fascinating. And I know that Aunt Arabella had the most amazing past. And of course was a spy, as not to be a spoiler or anything, but we find out in the Pink books that she was a spy in her young days. And so this would be the Aunt Arabella series, sort of like MMK's Death In series, if anyone's read that. But, you know, with more spies. And, but my agent, when I say this, is always like, yeah, about that. So I figure I'll wait until I have 2 kids in school and time to write more than 1 book a year. So I can keep my agent happy by writing the book she wants me to write, but also write a series for my own amusement. So her compromise to me, though, because I really miss series writing, was that my next book out is set around the Smith College Relief Unit in World War I. I'll talk, if anyone's curious, I can talk about that a lot more length later. But the book I'm writing after that is a kind of prequel to that. So it's not a series per se, but they're linked books that share characters and a similar universe. And so that assuages some of my series longing. But one day I will write a real series again with characters that will come back to bite me.
So I mean, everybody's muted, so I don't think you can hear that we're all squeeing and being like, yes, yes.
Yeah, just urge the pandemic to be over and schools to reopen so I can sort of shunt my children off there so I have more writing time.
Okay. So we have a question about, have you struggled at all with writing during quarantine where your regular writing routines might be disrupted? If so, what are some things you do to stay focused and productive while dealing with all the isolation and being stuck inside most of the time? Thanks for creating such detailed and engaging characters regardless of the setting or time period you're writing about.
Oh, thank you for that lovely comment. The hardest thing for me is not the being inside. You know, I could happily be a mole person and just live inside with books and my own imaginary world. The hardest thing is having no childcare, because, you know, that's the whole it takes a village thing. It took a babysitter and a school and all that. And my husband and I have, and our 2 kids, I have a 2-year-old and a 6-year-old. We've been in New York apartment now for 3.5 months, just the 4 of us. And I won't lie, it's been really hard. And my husband works in finance, so he has one of those jobs where you don't take time off. So our deal was that I would do childcare from 7 a.m. to 11. I get 11 to 1 to write, and then I'm back on with the kids from 1 to 8. So it has not been a perfect system, but sort of like execution, it concentrates the mind wonderfully. I was on deadline with the Smith book, the upcoming book, when we went into quarantine, and I was kind of amazed by how much I managed to write in those 2 hours a day. Recently, things have sort of fallen apart a bit because, well, for various reasons I won't go into. My husband's out of town, so I'm on full-time childcare. So I'm sort of dealing with the fact that everything is on hold until I get my 2 hours a day back. But yeah, for me, that's the hardest because I adore my children, but they're not at an age yet, especially the male 2-year-old who thinks he's a human wrecking ball, where they can be told, okay, mommy's working, entertain yourself. Because they're still at the age where if they're silent, something is very, very wrong. And I might have to call 911 and pick up the bodies.
Yes, I think a lot of us are have been there too. But how do you stay focused on your writing for those 2 hours? I mean, is it completely quiet? Do you get away from that? Like,
well, my Christmas present was a lock on the bedroom door. And sometimes the toddler will bang on the door and shout, "Mommy!" But usually he can be distracted with dinosaurs. And so, yeah, that's the way it works. My quarantine present was an espresso machine. I brew myself my 2 shots worth of Nespresso, pour in lots of flavored creamer, flee into the bedroom, lock the door, sit down at the computer. And for that time, I just work. We did have, I mean, for those who like the funny domestic behind the scenes stories, the day my book was due and I was down to the wire because the Smith book is one of those whoppers that kind of expanded beyond my imagining and was sort of running up around 150,000 words. And so on the day of deadline, I had one chapter left. I was getting there, but my husband had a meeting at 1 o'clock when my writing time ended and could not give me any extra time. So I was like, okay, I took my computer out to the dining room with me. I was like, okay, the kids can play for like 10 minutes. What could possibly go wrong while I finish this chapter? Apparently, my husband had let them fill the pool of the Barbie dream house. There may have been a flood. There may have been slipping. There may have been screaming. But I finished the chapter. And then I spent a lot of time mopping things up and bandaging people up. But that was what it took to focus. But mostly it's the lock on the door and the Nespresso machine. They make all the difference.
Gotcha. Gail would like to know, when are you going to write your English Civil War novel? I'd love to read that.
Yeah, it's almost become a running joke for me. When I finished The Summer Country, which was, again, The Summer Country lived with me for 10 years, and I really thought I was never actually going to write that book. And so when I wrote it and it was there and it wasn't horrible, I was like, wow, maybe impossible things do happen. And I called my agent and said, you know what? I'm going to write my English Civil War novel next. And she said, yeah, do that. That's actually not a bad idea. Write the English Civil War novel. So I spent 6 months getting back into all the material I used to know so well and researching it and plotting it. And I got a call from my agent who said, so yeah, the market's kind of changed again. No one's going to read English Civil War. It might not kill your career, but it's certainly not going to do good things for your, continuing to be able to write books. Find something else to write. And fortunately, I had an idea that had sort of, another one of these things that left out me and caught my imagination. So I was able to be like, well, what about Smith College alumni during World War I? And she's like, yay, great, World War I, people read World War I. But so the English Civil War book is on hold again. So it's now become a running joke that whenever I want to scare my agent, I can say, so I'm going to write my English Civil War novel. I really hope that the popular imagination, it's so funny because for a while after The Other Boleyn Girl, everyone was reading Tudors. And it was, The Other Boleyn Girl's third cousin twice removed. And then people rebounded off that really hard. And for a while now, pretty much all the historical fiction out there has been 20th century, which I personally, as a person who always looked down upon the 20th century as sort of not really historical, find a little disappointing. And I am hoping the pendulum will swing back again. I don't know if it will swing back to the English Civil War, but I'm hoping it will swing back in that direction. So I don't know. My guess is maybe when I'm 90, I'll write the English Civil War novel, but who knows? You just never know. I'm a little bit worried that if I ever did write it, a fireball would, exterminate the earth or something, because it's one of those impossible things I keep saying will happen and never does.
Well, we keep our fingers crossed. Linda has a question that I actually have as well. Your stories are woven together so well. How do you plot to make that happen? And how are you able to plot when you work with other authors on the same book?
The funny thing is those are two very different experiences. When I write my own books, I hate to say it, it's a bit like ice skating. I'm fine as long as I don't look at my feet. I have very little idea how I do what I do. I spend a lot of time scribbling on pieces of paper. The trial and error method I worked out with my first couple of books that I still use is I only outline about 5 chapters ahead. I have a vague idea of where I think the book is going. I often label things and then something happens. But I've learned that I'm very character driven and I have to get to know my characters. And if I try to plot too far ahead, too specifically, I get stuck because my characters will develop in one way, but I'm trying to force them into a plot that no longer works for them. And thank God my subconscious is smarter than I am. So it figures out these plot twists for me and it feeds me things that later I'm like, oh, that's why that character was there. Or of course, this is how that had to end. Oh, that's why I had that back there before. But I don't really plot it all out beforehand. I have a running plot where I have to have some sense of where I'm going, but I can't know too much or I run it. It's like quicksand. I start sinking. On the other hand, when I plot with Beatrice and Karen, the funny thing is we all kind of work that way on our own books. But when we work together, we make a complete outline. And when we did this the first time with the Forgotten Room, we sat down together over umpteen pots of tea. We were so wired, it was scary. And we plotted out the whole book. And then we wrote it. And it was the easiest writing experience any of us had ever had. And we were like, wow, that's amazing. And then we all ran off and tried to plot our own next books and crashed and burned. We couldn't do it on our own. And we reverted back to our normal methods for that. But we've decided it's because when we write together, we have other brains to bounce these things off of. So the problems you'd usually hit by yourself when you're developing characters and writing, we're thrashing out in advance when we're working together. But you can't do that on your own. You just can't spin off your brain into other brains like that.
Okay. Claire would like to know, how much research do you do for a book and how much coffee do you need?
Oh my God, so much coffee, particularly now with the whole quarantine thing. But research-wise, so I was this nerdy, history nerdy teenager who, instead of getting 17 magazine, I had a subscription to The Writer. And one of the articles in there that made the deepest impression on me as a writer was a piece by John Jakes talking about how he researched his books. And what he said was that before he even starts writing, he would spend a year immersing himself in the time period, not even taking notes, just reading everything he could find and letting it percolate in his brain and shape the story. And that really stuck with me. And that's why I try to do not a year, because frankly, for a while I was actually writing 2 books a year. So if I had spent a year researching, I would already be 2 books behind. But I try to spend at least 2 months doing nothing but reading. And actually that's the phase I'm in right now with the book I'm working on. I'm in the read everything phase, because I found that completely changes the shape I thought a book would have. And with Summer Country, I was so worried because I am not a Caribbean historian. It's a very specific, especially Barbados history is its own very specific sub-history. I spent 2 years researching that book. Of which about a year was doing nothing but solid reading and hitting up friends that's actually why one of the reasons I had a big gap between books was I spent so long researching the Summer Country, because I really wanted to make sure I got right. Of course, you never know everything you're going to need. So with any book, no matter how long you research, you wind up doing what I call spot research, where you're in the middle of the book and you're like, oh crap, what would that thing have been? Or what happened on a specific day? And you have to run around and hunt that one thing down. But I found that I like to do the bulk of my research beforehand.
Okay. Sounds like a lot of coffee.
Oh my gosh, so much coffee. And actually the weird thing is I often find it harder to concentrate during the research part than the writing part. The research part actually requires more coffee for me, because what will happen is I'll read something, I'll think it's really cool, and my imagination starts wandering. And it's very hard to get back to the research book. Whereas when I'm writing, I'm very much immersed in that world. I'm with the characters. There's a zone. And the zone is not research. I'm much more distractible. Maybe I think it's because I'm constantly like, ooh, shiny, I could use this thing. How can I use this thing? And it's just like, I'm like a magpie.
So Sujatha says, some authors put epilogues online for popular books. We all want to know what happened to those characters after the story ended. Would you consider doing something like that?
I was about to say I have, but I switched website providers a couple of years ago, and some things got lost during the transition. So at some point I need to double check and make sure those made it up there. Because I actually have a running joke about epilogues.
Hold on one second.
Sure.
Got it.
So I always write epilogues, and then usually whichever editor I'm with at the time tells me, no, don't use the epilogue. So it's sort of a joke that I write epilogues, but they're never included. Summer Country was unusual because they let me keep my epilogue. So I'm very proud of that epilogue. It's the epilogue that survived. But yes, somewhere on my website, there should be missing epilogues from that summer and a bunch of Pink books.
Okay. So Ashley says she wants to see that new series happens. It sounds great. Considering the variety of settings and time periods across your books, what kind of research, preparation, or travel do you do to get a feel of the place or time period?
So travel is something I have not been able to do as much of. Back before I had kids, I would do that. Although I found that it was often a double-edged sword, because places have an annoying way of not being preserved in amber. People like to continue to live in them and build in them, which is very annoying of them. I almost got run over by a moped when I was looking for the Temple prison in Paris, or sorry, not the Temple prison, the Abbey prison, which had been plowed down by Baron Haussmann, and he put the Boulevard Saint-Germain where it used to be, which was incredibly irritating of him. So I'm standing there like, okay, so it would have stood around here, and meanwhile traffic is whizzing around me. I had the same problem when I was living in London, and I would pass, there's this little plaque that says Tyberg Hill was here. And Tyberg Hill was the 18th century place of execution. It was this almost rural sort of place where you would take the family to go and see a good hanging. And now it's just like any other London street with whitewashed buildings around and all that. And I found that incredibly jarring. It was easier for me to imagine the real place without actually being there because it had changed so much. That being said, I would have loved to have taken a tax-deductible trip to Barbados to research this book. But I did go to Barbados to research summer country years ago when I first had the idea. By the time I got the green light for the book, I was pregnant with my second child and there was Zika. And so I was not able to go back. So I relied very heavily on maps, pictures, contemporary accounts. And so, which sort of brings me into, that's one of the things I use a lot. I like to use contemporary accounts because they tell me not only what a place would have looked like at the time, but how people perceived it. The funny things like weather changes, like England in the time period in which I usually write about it was in the Little Ice Age. It was colder than it is now. It snowed a lot more. And so when you read contemporary accounts, you get a very good idea of what the people there were experiencing, as well as just, the actual layout of the land and the landmarks. And the most valuable thing to me is when I can find someone from the perspective of my characters. So, for example, when I was writing Summer Country, I had this amazing librarian friend. She's my secret weapon. And she found me the letters of an English woman who was visiting Barbados in 1854, the exact same year when my later portion of the book is set. And so I was able to read, in my heroine in the 1854 bit is an English woman first coming to Barbados. And so I was able to see what would an English woman find striking or different or just noticeable about Barbados. And that makes such a difference.
So I do have to just comment that librarians are the best.
Oh my
and that's
God,
not self-serving whatsoever. We have some really great comments from Lynn. She says, doesn't your agent know we would read a grocery list if you wrote it?
Oh, thank
Dale
you.
says, Philippa Gregory is writing English Civil War now, so it is a possibility. And Teresa says, I was worried at first that the Barbie dream pool water was going to have ended up on your computer.
Oh God, no. No, actually, I will tell you, it's very funny. When I was getting to work on the Smith book, what feels like 5,000 years ago, in what my husband calls the before times, when I still went to Starbucks to work, when we were allowed out of the house, I remember it was like, how you have those days where you're like, this is going to be the first day of the new book. And I'd already started the book. I had a few chapters, but there had been a hiatus for book tour. I was on book tour with Beatrice and Karen for our latest collaborative book, All the Ways We Said Goodbye. And I came back from book tour. I was like, I'm really going to get going on the Smith book now. And I'm going to go to Starbucks and I'm going to write a whole chapter. And I was so excited. I got my favorite table spot behind a little screen where no one can see you. But I didn't realize someone had swapped the table there for the table with the wonky leg. And I sat down, I put my coffee down next to the computer, I turned the computer, I pulled up the file, and then I accidentally, I put my elbow down the table. The whole thing flipped. And my full caramel macchiato went into my keyboard. And I am there like blotting with napkins, but the weirdest thing was my screen shrunk. I've never seen anything like it. I had these you mentioned the Barbie dream house, Barbie doll sized pages lined up on my screen. And I could not get them to expand. It was, yeah. So I ordered a new caramel macchiato and went home, and it was not the first day of the rest of the book. But bizarrely, my computer recovered. I'm not sure how or why. Maybe it liked coffee, but it eventually did recover, and it gave me those pages back. But it was a very bad hour or so.
That would be. Lisa would like to know, what are you currently reading for pleasure?
Okay. This is a funny one. So two things. One is, I have found the pandemic has definitely affected my reading. I have been reading my way through the vast oeuvre of Patricia Wentworth. If anyone had, it's the weird thing is I had never heard of her before. And my good friend Donna Thorland, who's also a writer, but who I've known since I was 18 because The World Has 10 People in It, she recommended her to me. And I was like, I've never heard of this person. Contemporary of Agatha Christie and Dorothy Sayers, wrote this like endless mystery series about a spinster detective, Miss Silver, who calmly knits baby booties for her endless great nieces and nephews while always solving the crimes. And I find these books insanely addictive right now. And I think it's because it's this wonderful sort of England, the first books are in the 1920s, they go through to the 1960s, but it's this wonderful English world where there's always tea at the vicarage. There's usually some sort of inheritance dispute at the manor house, and Miss Silver always solves the crime, and you know that the world will be put right in the end. And right now, the idea where we have so much uncertainty and we have no idea what's going on, the idea that the world will be put right in the end is terribly reassuring. And so I have just been I keep telling myself, I'm going to read something else. I've been sent arcs I'm meant to read, but I just keep compulsively pulling up the next Miss Silver book. But I have branched out. So my amazing readers have been recommending for years that I read, especially Sheila Churchill, who I don't think is here, has been telling me for years that I have to read Jodi Taylor's St. Mary's series about time traveling historians. And just for some reason, this never wound up happening. But I wound up getting the first one like 2 weeks ago. And the funny thing is my husband, who's a sci-fi reader, and we have this very small Venn diagram where our reading tastes actually overlap, was like, oh yeah, I read that years ago. That's great. How have you never read that? It's on our Kindle. And so I pulled it out and now I'm addicted because they're kind of like the Pink Carnation series on speed. It's like if Eloise were even snarkier and had time travel, these would be the sort of things she would be involved in because they're historians that travel through time, supposedly to chronicle what happened or verify what happened, but always get in these crazy scrapes. And they're hilarious and wonderful. I'm on the third book right now. So for anyone who loved the Pink series, try Jodi Taylor's Chronicles of St. Mary's.
Will do. Oh my gosh, that's a great suggestion.
And also, if you need reassurance, read Patricia Wentworth's Miss Silver books. The first couple are not very good. I can say that. I don't like to say bad things about other authors, but she's dead, so it's okay. The first couple are sort of like the sensational novels that Dorothy Sayers makes fun of in her books. But then by the third or fourth book, she's on full-on Agatha Christie Miss Marple mode, and they are the most soothing things ever.
So Nicole would like to know, how did you write the dialogues, quips, and puns in the Pink Carnation? Do you say it out loud to yourself as you're writing? Were you snickering at your computer as you were writing?
Sometimes I do say them out loud, which is a little awkward when I'm at Starbucks. It's a good way to clear tables and get people to move away. Mostly I don't, because I do tend to work in public at Starbucks. I do make strange faces though. That's the thing. When I'm trying, the weirdest thing I do when I'm writing is I do facial expressions because I'm trying to figure out exactly how you would describe a certain facial expression. So, and the dialogue, I find it's funny. I had one editor who is no longer my editor complain to me once, and I quote, "Your characters are very talky." Because I find my characters just banter. They just do that. They just have these big conversations and they keep going and they feed off each other. It just goes like that. And often the hardest part for me with any book is deleting banter. And I always have to. I always have to go and weed through, and they'll go off track, especially with the Pink books. And the one I remember the most with that was the fifth book, The Temptation of the Night Jasmine. There were whole chapters worth of Charlotte and Robert talking that I just had to delete because they would just sort of get off track and ramble. I'd be like, but guys, there's a plot. We have to get back to the plot. And they're like, go away. Go away, author. We're talking. Don't interrupt us. So I would sort of let them go and then I would go back and delete pages and pages later. But yeah, dialogue comes easy for me somehow. The characters just do it.
So to go back to a question somebody asked earlier about putting online sequels, would you consider doing deleted scenes?
Actually, that was another thing that was on the old website, and I need to check and see. It was supposed to be transferred to the new website, but I feel so, the poor web people who had to transfer my website, they were like, wow, you have a lot of material here, because it was something like 15 years of accretion, because I had done my website by trial and error. I had added things like deleted scenes and epilogues and outtakes and quizzes and anything that struck my fancy at any time. And my amazing web mistress would just let me build these things on in a rather haphazard way. So it was like one of those crazy English houses where every generation builds on a new wing and none of it really makes sense. So they did their best to transfer most of it, but somewhere on the website there should be the outtakes from all of the Pink books and from some of the standalones. It was one of those things I did very religiously with the Pink books. And then around when I was winding up the Pinks and starting the standalones and writing 2 books a year was also when I had kids. And suddenly I had less time to do that sort of thing. So there are fewer from the later books. But it's purely a time issue.
Okay. Linda would like to know if there will be a sequel to The Summer Country.
No, it's purely a standalone. I love those characters. I loved living with them. I love the way that some of them surprised me. The book did not end the way I thought the book was going to end. And that was entirely down to the character of Jenny. And I'm not going to say more because spoilers, but it's really very much a one-off.
Okay. Sujatha says she's a librarian and has to agree with me about librarians being awesome. She says she just finished All the Ways We Said Goodbye, the latest book you co-wrote with Karen and Beatrice. She loved the characters from the 2 earlier books you wrote, and she enjoyed the World War I and II settings a lot. And Lisa said, me too. So I'm going to, let's move back a little bit. What about a book about what happened to Georgie and Annabelle? Lynn asks.
Well, that's a funny story. So that book, I originally started it thinking it was going to be a standalone. That was another one of these books. The English Wife was another one of these books I wasn't supposed to write. My editor at the time really wanted me to write a family saga, preferably set in Palm Beach. I was like, no, I won't do Palm Beach, but I'll do Paris. Paris also begins with P. And, I'm much more familiar with Paris and Palm Beach. And so I sat there, I was trying to plot out a saga set in Paris, and it was flat and horrible, the way books that you're told to write often are. And I had this image in my head of a woman in Gibson girl garb tumbling off a parapet, and I couldn't get this image out of my head. And I called my agent. I was like, so there's this book I have to write. There's this woman falling off a parapet, and I have to find out why. And so The English Wife was really an unplanned book. I had Georgie popped into my head full blown. I heard her voice in my head like I hadn't heard anyone's voice in years. And I wrote that book, and as I was about 3/4 of the way through it, I realized that there was a trilogy in it. And I called my editor, and who I adored, and said, so I think this needs to be 2 more books. And she was like, yay, 2 more books, do it. And the second book was going to be about, for those of you who have read it, Anne and the 2 children in Paris in summer of 1899. And the third book was going to be about the daughter, Viola, around World War I. And both books were going to be part of an arc that would fill in what happened to Georgie. And I was starting to plot that book. This is sort of one of these behind the scenes vagaries of publishing stories, when my amazing, wonderful editor who I adored was let go. And that had been the last, English Wife had been the last book in my contract with them. And my agent said, okay, time to move houses. But you can't do it with the second book in a trilogy. You have to do something different. So that those 2 books that were going to be the sequels to English Wife were abandoned, and I wrote The Summer Country instead. Wow. So I wrote The Summer Country. I am sad that I will not write the sequels to The English Wife. And this is, it's one of those things where as a reader, I've often wondered, wow, why did the author not write another book there? Or why did the series stop when it did? And wearing my author hat, it's funny because often these behind the scene things that no one would imagine happen, like editors being fired or people having to move houses or whatever it is. And it's, there's one logic demanded by the stories themselves, and another logic demanded by the realities of publishing.
Very true. Lisa says, any chance you might make a blog type story of episodes for your readers to follow? Maybe something from Team W.
I actually, at the start of the pandemic, when I had a lot of fear-filled adrenaline and Nespresso-fueled adrenaline, I started writing. I was going to do a serial for my readers that I was loosely calling Pandemic Pink. It was about Eloise and Colin now and their two teenage kids in quarantine with 99-year-old Aunt Arabella in London. And the historical subplot was the Crimean War, and a Selwick, Flora Selwick, during the Crimean War with Florence Nightingale. And I was, oh my God, Eloise was talking to me like crazy. I was going to release it a chapter at a time on my website. But then unfortunately, my husband's work ramped up. Again, no childcare. And so the 3 hours a day I was going to get for work time became 2 hours a day. I had to finish the Smith book. I'm under contract for the next book. So basically the time I thought I was going to use to write Pandemic Pink went away. And right now I have no childcare, even my husband. So there is no Pandemic Pink time. But I am hoping at some point, some form of childcare will come back. And depending on what kind of handle I can get on the next book, Pandemic Pink might wiggle its way in. Even though, if you want to, terrify my agent, just tell her I'm writing anything pink related.
Jessica would like to know, do you picture your writing as you go to build their world?
Wait, sorry, could you repeat? I missed that, sorry.
Do you picture your writing as you go to build the world, for the world building?
No, I don't. I often struggle with phrasing. For me, it's like I'm seeing scenes playing out in my head, and I'm desperately trying to record them before they go away. And I'm trying to record them as accurately and as fairly as I can. But I found I was about to say there are two kinds of authors. There are probably about 5,032 kinds of authors. But the two kinds of authors I've noticed are, there are authors who plan things out and build their world very deliberately. And there are authors whose world builds itself for them. And I'm definitely the latter sort. I always go back to, there's this amazing poem by Michelangelo, where he talked about how he wasn't sculpting the sculptor. He was freeing the shape that was already in the stone. And that's the way I feel about writing books, that somewhere in the ether, these stories and these characters are there. And I am groping my way towards them, trying to figure out what's going on with them. But it's a matter of observing and finding rather than my creating. Which sounds a little crazy. It's sort of like hearing voices.
Good to know. So we've had a couple of people ask about the Smith series, or Smith books. If you could talk about that, you had mentioned that.
Yeah. So while we were researching All the Ways We Said Goodbye, which is the latest collaborative novel, we needed to find out something about Christmas customs in Picardy in World War I. And I stumbled on, because you're trying desperately to find these things that you think would be easy, but often the things you think will be hard to find are somehow easy to find. And the things you think will be easy to find, there's no information on. You're like, why not? This should be so easy. But I stumbled on a memoir by a Smith alum who was there in the Somme in World War I in Christmas 1917. I had one of those moments when you're like, what on earth is she doing there? And not only was she was there with a whole group of other Smith women. And I was really intrigued. So I fell down the Smith rabbit hole and discovered that, in fact, a charismatic alum in 1917 had come and given a talk at the Smith College Club in Boston, saying that, basically there was this incredible suffering going on in Europe, and there was a need of humanitarian aid, and what they really needed were Smith women to do it. Because if you want anything done, you ask an all-girls school girl. And within 3 months, she'd assembled a team of 18 Smith alums, social workers, drivers, 2 female doctors. They'd gone to gather supplies, and they were on a ship to France. And the plan was that they would set up their base right behind the front lines, because what had happened was in March of 1917, so sorry, backing up a bit. You can tell I haven't been talking about this book much yet. So basically, in World War I, the Germans invaded. And we all know about German-occupied France in World War II, but what people don't know, and we did write about a bit in All the Ways We Said Goodbye, was that the Germans occupied a chunk of France during World War I. And they were not friendly occupiers. But they were driven out of part of that in March of 1917. And what they did was they systematically rounded up all of these villagers. They drove them to one village. And by drove, I don't mean like in cars. I mean herded them all to one village. And then they set about destroying all of their villages. They poisoned the wells. They blew up their houses. They destroyed any kind of agricultural equipment, any kind of food, anything that could give them shelter or sustenance. And then they took those villagers and said, welcome home, you can go back now. Because the idea was that these villagers would then be a drain on the French government and hinder their war effort. And to make it worse, they had already deported most of the able-bodied young men and women to work camps in Germany. So the villagers we're talking about here were very young children, very old men and women, mostly women, and some middle-aged women. They were an incredibly helpless group, and they were left there to starve. And so Harriet Boyd Hawes heard about, she saw this, and she came back and she mobilized this group that she called the Smith College Relief Unit. And they went out there to deliver and this was not war work in the traditional sense. They were not working with the army or for the army. They were purely there to deliver humanitarian aid to French villagers. And their story is incredible. And I immersed myself in players. Again, librarians are magic. I was not able to go to Northampton to wallow in the archives. So the amazing librarians in Smith College Special Collections sent me over 2,000 pages worth of photocopies of their letters and journals. And it reads better than fiction. For a while when I was writing this book, I got really discouraged because I was like, I should just write an annotated version of their letters. It would be better than anything I can write. But the book did eventually get written, and I am so thrilled with it. I can't wait to share it with everyone. So that's what this book is about. It's about these 18 Smith women who went over during World War I to help villagers and found themselves on the front lines themselves.
Wow. I'm sure we're all like, yay, we can't wait for that one.
Well, and what I love about it is like, I'm an all-girls school girl myself. So there is nothing you can tell me about sort of the infighting among groups of girls. And I found the character clashes within the group deeply fascinating. And the way that they managed to pull together despite it all, but there are all these weird little sort of subcurrents and rivalries going on at the same time.
Yeah. We have a couple more questions, but I had forgotten to ask you, do you want to read a little bit from The Summer Country or any book that you might have on hand?
You know what, I that is lovely of you, but I think I would rather stick to answering questions. I do love reading. I read fiction competitively in high school. Believe it or not, that was a thing. But I should warn you. So I'm on my daughter's laptop, and we have time limited her screen time. And it just warned me it's going to cut off in 5 minutes. So at some point I may disappear for 2 minutes while I have to put in the passcode to get back in, because I forgot to disable this. Sorry, my daughter is 6. So there are all these weird things my husband put on so she can't have too much screen time. Unfortunately, I forgot that this might rebound on me.
All right, well, we'll talk amongst ourselves while you're resetting. So we do have a couple more questions. Sujatha said, has anybody approached you to make a TV series or a movie about the Pink novels?
All I will say is cross all your fingers and toes, knock on wood. I have been down this road many times, so I don't want to jinx anything, but please hope for it as hard as you can. And maybe at some point I'll have something to announce to you. So, but I'm not saying anything because jinxing.
Got it. Lisa says, will we get a Zoom from Team W anytime soon? You're also amazing. Would love to see you interacting together.
Thank you. You shouldn't, but you do not want to see our weekly happy hours. You really don't, trust me. Let's see, what was I thinking? Oh yes, Zoom from Team W. So sorry, I was distracted by the "we do" comment. You don't know what you're asking for there. Yes, there is an event coming up, and I should remember what it is, but again, small children on really annoying sleep schedules. It's either July 7th or 8th. We were supposed to do a lunch event, but it's being converted to a free Zoom event. So I promise I will post about that on my website and on Facebook, on Instagram really soon. Karen, who is more on the ball, has already posted about it. So again, it's either July 7th or 8th around lunchtime. So look on Karen's Instagram and you'll find it.
Okay. Well, I actually don't have any more questions at this point. So I know that you're like, you might have to go out for a couple of minutes, but we could just say goodnight to everybody.
Sure. Thank you so much for coming, everyone. And thank you for the really wonderful questions. You know, if you had anything you wanted to ask, but didn't feel like you could, always feel free to email me. It might take me a little longer to email back than usual because the no childcare thing and my toddler being like, mommy, get off the phone. Stop looking at your phone and look at me, mommy. But anyway, but I will answer eventually. So please do feel free to email with any other questions. I will also be Zooming with another library on Thursday if you would like to come back for a repeat performance. It's always different, as you can see. I sort of speak off the cuff and don't always think before I speak. So it will be a different performance. So feel free to come back on Thursday while I'll be Zooming with Warren Newport Public Library in Gurnee, Illinois. And thank you so much, Mina, for doing this. I really appreciate it.
This has been fantastic, more than I could have ever hoped for. So I appreciate you taking the time. And I do appreciate everybody who came and has asked all these wonderful questions. So I got to know you better too.
Thank you. Thank you to everyone. And stay safe out there.
Yes, everybody. And we'll hopefully see you again soon. I'll send out a recap of the conversation and the YouTube link. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye, everybody.